Good morning, everyone, or good morning to those of you in Washington time, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome so many of you for an incredibly topical and real-world discussion, the rise of vaccine nationalism and the arguments to be made for an international agreement before the national identity of the new vaccine is found. We're delighted to have with us today my colleague Chad Bown from the Peterson Institute and Tom Bolky, who runs Global Health Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. I'll turn to them in a second. I just want to say that this is on the record, that we are trying to keep up with the latest technology. So we have a Q&A function in Zoom, and I would welcome people voting up questions they think are of particular interest or well put, which we will then put to our authors and speakers later in the program. I also want to thank our colleagues at Foreign Affairs, Daniel Kurtz-Phelan, Gideon Rose, and the whole team who worked with Tom and Chad to get out their very important article and chose to release it early yesterday on the Foreign Affairs CFR website, since it is so important an issue and we want to keep up with this. And we are delighted to play our part at Peterson in promoting this important topic with today's event and other outreach. I think the biggest important message to take away, although the details and the concept that Tom and Chad take us through is very important, is that this is another example of, during the pandemic, international cooperation that can be in everyone's interest and will cost no one anything. It is just a question of getting past distrust and making it a collective action problem being solved. This is something that I and my colleagues, including Maury Obstfeld, including Chad, have argued around the G20, and we've seen evidence of this kind of cooperation taking place, particularly in the financial sphere, in central bank actions, and to some degree, although insufficiently, on developing country debt. But we've all said, and Tom as well has argued, that this isn't about being nice or humane or just, although those are reasons to do something. This is about doing something that is in the United States' own self-interest, in China's own self-interest, and the EU countries' own self-interest, as they will explain. And this isn't about, I give you something now, so you give me something later, or I trade off this versus that. This is a collective combination to get the low-hanging fruit. And we don't want to squander that fruit in a world where our scientists have made so much progress so quickly and provide us with the ultimate hope we need for dealing with this pandemic. So in this regard, let me introduce the authors of The Tragedy of Vaccine Nationalism, Only Cooperation Can End the Pandemic. Chad Bown is the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute. He's the second person to hold that chair, and like its predecessor, Gary Huffbauer, he sits almost uniquely able to bring together academic research on trade, legal practice on trade, and policy concerns. We've been delighted to have him with us for 2 years. Or more than 2 years, for 4 years. Previously, he served as a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. And of course, he's the co-host of the top economics podcast, Trade Talks, with Sumaya Keynes. We're also delighted to welcome to our stage Thomas Bolky, who, as I mentioned, is director of the Global Health Program and senior fellow for Global Health Economics and Development at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law School, has been incredibly influential on task forces from the CFR, from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and has written a major book that came out in 2018 that unfortunately was somewhat prophetic about plagues and the paradox of progress. Tom will speak first, Chad second. I'll pose a couple questions and then we'll open it to the audience as a whole. Thank you all for joining us. Tom, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Adam, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the broader Peterson team for convening this event. It's a pleasure always to work with my good friend Chad, but also to work with all of you on this project. So I'm going to start by laying out the stage for the problem that we face, the tragedy of vaccine nationalism. As Adam suggested, the one part of this process in response to this pandemic that has worked well has been the science. Since the genetic sequence became available in China, within days, vaccine candidates had started to be in development, and within 66 days, the first clinical trial was begun. Scientists and companies are racing all over the world to develop vaccines against this coronavirus. There are 164 candidates currently overall. 25 are in clinical development, meaning clinical trials. 5 are in the latest stage of clinical development. 3 of those candidates are involving Chinese entities. 1 is in the UK, and 1 is in the United States. But what happens once the first vaccine, or perhaps several vaccines, are proven safe and effective to the satisfaction of regulatory authorities? Most countries cannot make vaccines. Vaccine manufacturing is fundamentally different than small molecule drug manufacturing. It is quite scarce. It is a complex process, every stage of which is overseen by regulatory authorities. It's expensive. And it's restricted to particularly the production of the active ingredients of vaccines are restricted to really just a handful of countries. There's efforts afoot to try to increase that manufacturing capacity, and those are worthwhile, but they will not meet early demand for this vaccine. To remember that most of the vaccines under consideration are likely to require more than 1 dose. So any numbers you hear reported in the press about early doses secured, you should probably cut it in half. And of course, this is a pandemic that's affecting the world. So the demand is in billions. Our early doses are likely to be in tens of millions, or at best hundreds of millions. In the past, in health crises where medical supplies have been limited, wealthy nations have hoarded. So in the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic, wealthy nations bought up virtually all the supplies of vaccines. It was only after the World Health Organization appealed for donations that the US, Canada, and 7 other nations agreed to share 10% of their vaccine supplies, but only after being certain they could meet all of their domestic demand and being certain that the virus was nowhere near as deadly as it was initially forecasted. Of course, in the early stages of this pandemic, over 70 countries plus the EU imposed export restrictions on on personal protective equipment, ventilators, and other critical medical supplies. And Chad and others at Peterson have really done important work on this issue. Most of the countries that have issued those restrictions are the same countries where COVID-19 vaccines are being manufactured. In terms of the first effective therapeutics to emerge in this process, remdesivir, the US bought up 3 months of the world's supply before any other nation could get a hold of that drug. So we are trending in the wrong direction. Why does this matter? Well, it's in every nation's interest that there be a globally fair allocation of vaccines driven by public health need, because it's in every nation's interest that we bring this pandemic under control. If the virus continues to circulate unabated anywhere, it's of course remains a health risk everywhere. Most of the early vaccines are likely to afford protection against the disease, but not against underlying infection. So there will continue to be risks. If we have raging epidemics in other nations, there's risks to Americans' health. Of course, it also affects US interests. The viability of health systems and economies are at stake in this pandemic. Even countries that have done well in crushing the curve against this pandemic have seen significant economic consequences. Look at South Korea given how badly the pandemic has affected other nations, their trading partners. So we are connected in this regard, and we all have an interest. The last issue, of course, and the reason why we have an interest in moving this forward is global cooperation. There will be intense resentment against countries that hoard early supplies for vaccines for months and potentially longer. That diminishes the cooperation we will need to tackle future pandemics. But also, if we can't cooperate on a medical intervention that every country has an interest in sharing equitably globally, what global challenge are we going to be able to cooperate on? And it diminishes the prospects and confidence people have in that cooperation to address the many other collective challenges we face. There are efforts underway to try to avert this tragedy of vaccine nationalism, and it's important we note them. The Gates Foundation, Gavi, CEPI are behind an initiative called kovacs that is intended to pursue a collective approach, but they need the support of high-income countries to achieve their potential. And what we're seeing in just this last week alone is suggesting the process is moving in the opposite direction. The UK government and the US government bought up millions or spent billions to buy up millions of doses of potential vaccine candidates. And news reports came out of the EU that the European Commission had advised its member states not to pursue purchasing their vaccines for their own people through this collective initiative. So the challenge is there. What we describe in this article is that we're in a scenario where no country has an incentive to cooperate if every other country, high-income country and manufacturing country seems like they won't cooperate either. It's effectively the prisoner's dilemma from a game theory perspective. And in order to avert that outcome, we suggest what has moved historically non-cooperative dynamics to being cooperative dynamics is reciprocity. And that's what we seek to harness there. And with that, let me turn it over to Chad to talk a bit about what we propose to do that.
Thanks, Tom. You set it up perfectly. And I think the only thing that I'll add is maybe to flesh out a little bit of the details and the economics and maybe the history of how this reciprocity idea has worked previously. And so from the trade world, and I think what's really important in trying to think about why this is a critical policy problem and a very challenging policy problem to address is it requires the combination of folks that don't normally work together. It's going to require public health officials, scientists, and probably trade officials to come up with a global cooperative agreement here. And these aren't folks that typically are used to dealing with one another. So first, we've got to make the economic case, I think, as Tom did, about why it is that we need cooperation. There's obviously the public health aspects of it, but when I, as an international economist, think about this, it's not just my concern about people around the world being afflicted by this disease, but you can think about just what the economic implications of that are, right? We live in a globalized world with supply chains. If, in Mexico, for example, we've seen reports of this. They have to shut down their factories, their plants because of the pandemic raging there. Their workers can't go in. They don't supply the inputs that are needed in our factories, our auto plants in the United States to keep our factories up and running. So we need inputs. That's one reason to want, just for purely selfish reasons, are there countries that have their pandemic under control. Also, for purely selfish reasons, we want them to be growing because we want them to be able to buy our exports. A lot of our industries in the United States, other countries around the world, are export dependent. We need the world to be growing, not just our economies to be growing. So it's in our own selfish reasons to want to have this problem addressed economically. But that's the first thing that we have to convince policymakers, right? That it's not just for humanitarian reasons. There's actually economic reasons behind this as well. And then that the sharing idea is important. And I think probably, we'll see how this plays out. But it's from what you listen to the scientists explain, we can expect to see, I think, unfortunately, some disappointment. Some of the vaccines that look like they're close, right? They may not ultimately pan out. And that may be the vaccine from my country. And if that's the case, I'm going to want to have access to somebody else's vaccine. I'm going to have wished that way back at the beginning of this, we'd come up with a system where we agreed to share with each other. And whoever gets there first, you get some of it, but you share some of it with the rest of the world as well, in order that we can treat our sort of most critical people. And obviously here as well, we need the scientists to tell us who are the most critical people that need to be treated, right? Obviously healthcare workers, things like that, but identifying those kinds of problems. Suppose we could do all of that then, and convince policymakers around the world that it is in everybody's interest to sign up to one of these agreements. How do we harness this reciprocity? Because as Tom mentioned, a really big concern right now is we have seen episodes of nationalism in the COVID space for other areas. When countries were short on personal protective equipment and ventilators, they imposed export bans. And the worry here is that, yeah, countries might agree and sign up to some sort of deal ex ante, but once the first discovery gets made, that country is just going to renege and hoard all of the vaccine for themselves and go back on the deal, right? And if that's what's holding things up, you can understand why countries aren't clamoring to negotiate a deal in the first place. So we need to figure out how we would be able to enforce a deal so that countries would live up to it, even if they are the ones that discover it, that they would follow through with sharing. And is such a deal possible? Is such a deal enforceable? If it is, then maybe we can get everybody to come to the table and agree to share. So what would we use? Well, it turns out that this is a problem we deal with all the time in trade. This is basically how trade agreements are constructed. This is the reciprocity principle of trade agreements. When countries break the rules in the trading system, we can't throw them in jail, right? We can't ask them to pay fines. What we do is we authorize retaliation. So the question is, would there be similar sorts of levers and mechanisms here that could be used to enforce a deal that would commit countries to living up to it? And arguably there would be. And that's part of the nature of how these vaccines are ultimately going to be manufactured. As Tom mentioned, there's probably, unfortunately, only a handful of countries out there in the world with the very sophisticated manufacturing sectors, regulatory environments for which these vaccines are going to be able to be produced. But another feature is that we live in a globalized world, and a lot of these manufacturing countries are going to be reliant on imported inputs to be able to manufacture their vaccines. They're not going to have locally all of the supplies they need, whether it's the chemical ingredients or the vials and syringes that they might need to ultimately provide the dosages. These interdependencies in this context are actually a feature of the global trading system and these cross-border supply chains. Because what that means is if we come up with an agreement that everybody says, I'll participate, how do we enforce it? If somebody thinks about reneging down the line, if they discover it first, trading partners could say, well, in order to make that vaccine, you need some of the inputs that I provide to you. And if you start to renege, you won't get these inputs. Without the input, there's no output. And so inherently, this is how trade works, right? These interdependencies are what allows the trading system to remain open. And I think we think can be harnessed in this context to come up with an agreement that is ultimately enforceable. And so I think with that, I'll leave it there and we'll leave it open for questions.
Thank you, Chad, and thank you, Tom. We are starting to accumulate questions in the Q&A function, and I encourage people to submit them there and also to vote if you like a question and want to see it get asked. But before we go there, let me go to you all with two questions. The first is, I obviously am biased towards your view, even if the arguments weren't as incredibly compelling as you make them. But there is the fact, as mentioned up top, that China is a place where it's possible a vaccine might come from. And there is such a climate of hostility and distrust between China and the US and to some degree other countries at the moment. Realistically, and maybe this is a two-part question, one part for Tom, one part for Chad. Realistically, how likely is it that the Chinese will have a successful vaccine not, as Chad mentions, not just first, but one that works. And second, if that's the case, not how realistic, but what can be done to section off an agreement with China and other countries, including the US, on vaccines, even if we don't feel, in the words of, even if the US government feels, in the words of Secretary of State Pompeo, mistrust but verify. Tom?
Great. Thank you for the great question. So I think it's likely in general that we're going to see multiple vaccines emerge from this development process. That's a good thing. We need vaccines, so we need vaccine supplies. China has, as I mentioned, 3 late-stage candidates. The results from some of them have not been that strong, and they're fairly high side effects. The issue will ultimately be, I think China has a good chance of developing a vaccine. The question is whether or not other nations will want to use it. In the past, when China, for instance, developed a vaccine against Ebola, it was not used outside of China. China historically has not been a developer of vaccines. The challenge is compounded in this case by the fact of reports of China testing the vaccine out of a clinical trial setting. So giving it to the military, giving it to pools of company workers. From a legal perspective, that will mean other countries, including the US, can't accept that clinical trial data because it doesn't comport with international ethical requirements. So I think the most likely scenario in this case is one of the Chinese vaccine candidates prevails, and particularly more stringently regulated markets like the US market or Europe will not be willing to use it.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Chad, what do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think given, and again, this goes back to the nature of and how vaccine manufacturing is historically fundamentally different. There's only a handful of countries historically that have done this kind of thing and that have thus, interacted with, the Food and Drug Administration that regulates this, that is going to make them ultimately comfortable. Now, can the rules be bent or broken given the severity of, of this crisis today? I think, sure, right? If it came to light that their vaccines work. The second question, though, and I think an important one that you posed, Adam, is this likely to happen for other reasons? Put aside the science, put aside the regulatory environment, but given the geopolitical context between the United States right now and China, is this likely to happen? And that one, it's hard to know, right? I think there's obviously humanitarian arguments to try to make it work, to try to put to the side all of this other stuff. Not to say that other stuff isn't important, but this is human life, right? And to try to make it work. If it couldn't work, then you're left with kind of an interesting, world where, maybe you have China that comes up with a vaccine first, but it's not being used in Europe or the United States. But maybe it is being used in other places around the world. And then, you have the vaccines that are coming out of Europe, coming out of the United States. And you have games that are of sort of competition, perhaps. I mean, I think that would be a wonderful world in which to live in, that we have so many vaccines that that China, the United States, and Europe are fighting over each other to vaccinate lots of countries that aren't going to be able to provide these for ourselves. But I think ultimately a lot of this is going to go back to the policymakers and what they are willing to do. And are they willing to engage with each other despite all of the tensions that are happening?
So, Chad, just to follow up on that, and thank you both. I want to push a little harder. It's not so much about forecasting what they will or won't do. And obviously, the question is, in a sense, just, is there precedent for countries that don't get along and have fundamental issues, managing to isolate issues of, say, public health or climate or environmental disaster or natural disaster and work together? And I think the answer is obviously yes, and including with the Soviet Union in the past. But I mean, just let me push it a little bit more. I mean, if I'm sitting in USTR, which you both have direct experience with and are familiar with under the Ambassador Lighthizer regime, what's the danger? Is there a, I'm not asking you to defend their fanciful notions, just is there a credible danger that somehow making a deal with China on this is somehow going to affect the long-term struggle between US and China?
I mean, I don't think so personally, right? I think that, so another example of, doing the right thing despite moments of crisis was the Trump administration early in February, sent personal protective equipment to China, right? When China was suffering at the peak. Now, we didn't know how bad things were going to get in the United States at that stage, and they received a lot of criticism ex post from that. I thought undue. I thought, that was the right thing to do, the right humanitarian thing to do. So I think politically, there may be some pushback from that. Certainly you could write a bad deal, but assuming that they could write an equitable deal that would be, in good faith, designed to diversify the risk. I think that the challenge that you have with China in this space is, as Tom mentioned, because they don't have a history of producing these vaccines, there's a lot less insight as to how things work in China, and a lot less trust between our regulators and their regulators that you need, I think, to be confident that what this vaccine is actually going to deliver is actually what folks are saying it's going to deliver.
The only quick points I'll add there is, first of all, to endorse what you said, Adam, which is that there's a history in global health of rivals working together. That happened on the smallpox eradication campaign with the US and the Soviet Union. It happened in the 2013-2015 Ebola crisis with China and on the US. I think there's a very realistic possibility, provided there are consensus on effective interventions, that they will cooperate in addressing this pandemic. The question is, when will it happen? Will it happen after they've used all early supplies on their own populations, and then in subsequent years you see cooperation on addressing the needs of others, or does it happen earlier? And that's really what Chad and I are getting about, that first year after vaccines start to emerge, what do you see at that point? The gating factor is going to be, I do think you'll see some regulatory agencies willing to be flexible on, for instance, giving emergency use authorizations on vaccines, potentially before we know absolutely everything about them, the way that we would do if this was a 15-year process. I don't know if you'll see cooperation on a Chinese vaccine where nobody believes the underlying clinical trial data because it wasn't conducted in a clinical trial setting. And that's ultimately going to be what's going to hamper their ability to cooperate on these, is that will be disqualifying for a lot of countries. And that seems to be, at least from press reports, what's starting to occur.
Thank you both very much. Penny Goldberg from Yale, who's a Peterson colleague, tantalized us with the promise of 2 questions on the chat, but I only see 1. First one, do India or Brazil have the, oh no, it's 2 here. Okay, sorry. She's more concise than I give her credit for. First, do India and Brazil have the capacity to produce vaccines? And second, are there any estimates as to how large the production shortfall is likely to be? How many vaccines can realistically be produced in the first 2 months after approval of a vaccine?
So on the first question, well, I'll try to answer both. On the India and Brazil questions, absolutely. India is actually one of the rare countries out of traditional high-income country pharmaceutical powers that has developed a novel vaccine itself. They also have some of the largest contract vaccine manufacturing capacity in the world with the Serum Institute. So absolutely, they have the capacity. Brazil has vaccine manufacturing as well. They are historically have been further ahead of China in this process, although China, of course, is investing a lot in that. In terms of remind me the second question, Adam, I'm sorry.
Sorry,
Numbers.
Yeah, what realistically are the numbers you can get in the first couple?
So it will depend on which vaccine. We've actually never had a RNA vaccine reach regulatory approval before. Once and that capacity is quite limited. So some of the candidates, including the candidates that the US has been investing in, really involve technologies that are untested, and it'll take a while to ramp up the manufacturing capacity. If it is some of the older vaccine platforms, then we may be able to make more quickly. But as those more novel technologies come into place, they will allow for a greater volume. It'll just take a while to build up the capacity because it really is rather scarce at the moment.
Thank you, Tom.
Those are the two that were announced this week, right, Tom? The phase 3 that Pfizer and Moderna are doing, it started this week. Those are the new technology.
Our colleague Reinhilde Fugellers, please forgive me, Reinhilde, who is, of course, one of the world's leading experts on corporate innovation and R&D, as well as some of the others listening, raised the question of how do the private sector incentives play into this? I mean, the later clinical stages, as Chad just mentioned, are in the hands of biotech companies. So even if governments align on global coordination, do we still have sort of corporate nationalism? Do we need more incentives to define what corporates do? Or is the national cooperation enough, and then it just naturally proceeds from there? What do you guys think?
So a number of companies have expressed a interest early that they would reserve supplies for their host country. So Serum Institute, the CEO, again, this is the largest contract vaccine manufacturer in the world. In India, had indicated initially that supplies would be reserved for the Indian population. He has suggested subsequently that it may be 50-50 or something along those lines, but there will be some of that for companies. Others, like famously Sanofi, indicated that the US as a primary funder would receive early supplies and then has since backtracked over that. So nationalism will affect companies. Here's the thing though, ultimately from, again, a legal and a practical perspective, there's a limit to company control of those supplies. If they're in a country and the government decides to expropriate or impose an export ban, whatever contract the company has agreed to will not supersede that. So ultimately, this is the gating factor here is going to be the cooperation of governments. The private sector certainly plays a role in ramping up manufacturing and encouraging governments to do the right things, but ultimately it will be in the hands of the governments themselves.
So just Tom, a quick follow-up on that, coming up a question from Raymond Sainer. I mean, so there's no role, you think, or no need for compulsory licensing, including getting stuff out to the developing countries?
No, so this is where it's important that people understand the difference between small molecule drugs and vaccines. In HIV, many of you will remember the issues were ultimately around IP limiting licensing early in that crisis to generic producers in countries like South Africa and Brazil, middle-income countries for which pricing was difficult for pharmaceutical companies. They could do that because those countries had pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity. So IP was the gating factor. In this context, the gating factor really is vaccine manufacturing. And whether you grant non-exclusive licenses to the underlying technology doesn't mean anyone can make it. And the challenge that they ultimately have is that limited manufacturing capacity. I will also say companies have become much more forward-leaning on these access issues than they were in the early days of the HIV epidemic, where they're a little more savvy about access arrangements, particularly in poorer nations. And I expect you will see some of that in the context of a pandemic, because quite frankly, otherwise, a lot of countries and governments have already indicated they would do this, would issue compulsory licenses. And it is not in the interest of pharmaceutical industry to see serial compulsory licenses happen, because it undermines the business model fundamentally behind that industry.
Okay. This one's, I think, more for Chad. There are a number of people in our Q&A box who are raising the issue of international institutions. I mean, in a sense, we're resorting to the trade institutions and not even the WTO, a plurilateral trade agreement effectively, to replace the fact we don't have an international regime on vaccines. I mean, if you feel it's an unfair characterization, say so. But, so the question is, can we do better in that in the future? Is there room? I realize the WHO is particularly unpopular in certain parts these days, but nonetheless, is there room for some kind of regime? Kent Jones from Babson raises the possibility of, do you have some kind of WTO Annex 4 plurilateral agreement and at least try to formalize it rather than just have a national agreement? Just without being airy-fairy or wishing for globalist empires, what do you think about the international institutional aspects of this today and tomorrow?
So I think it's an important question. I think the reason why Tom and I both gravitated toward thinking about trade is because it really appears as if the gating factor, as Tom mentioned, is what national government through export bans. And that's a trade instrument. And so we need to figure out how to overcome that. As we started to kind of brainstorm and think about different ways in which we could overcome that, right? So come up with, even if we could get countries to agree, how would we enforce? How would we get countries to not actually do that if they discover it first? We ultimately came back to trade. And so that led us to believe that kind of trade is the way to think about this year. Now, I think this crisis does reveal to us that we probably need to step back and think about this when we're under less pressure to come up with something, especially if this is going to be kind of a new world where we're going to have to deal with this kind of problem on a repeated basis. But at least to start, I don't think we need to make it overly complicated, and get 164 WTO members involved that would slow things down. I think we need something that's a first step, and then we'll see how it goes, and then kind of we'll go from there. But I think for us, the critical thing is this really in our minds needs to happen now. Once somebody discovers it first, the incentives change entirely, and it becomes much, much more difficult to kind of envision how you're going to get an agreement that's as sort of symmetric as one could imagine up front. And so I think that's what puts us to emphasize the need to really get going on this thing 2 months ago.
Yeah. Very quick add on there. So Chad is exactly right. The only thing I would put it in addition to this, we do need a short-term arrangement to address COVID. Of short-term, I mean multi-year, but not forever in terms of applying to all vaccines. I do think in the long run, the lessons we learn from this will be important for needing infrastructure for future pandemics, because we cannot have this scenario where on an ad hoc basis, we're seeing this, what has happened in past pandemics, and we're seeing what's happening in the current pandemic happen. So having a constructive outcome from this will be important for laying the stage for how we address this threat later.
Okay, but thank you, Tom. But focusing on the current crises, one aspect which we need to talk about, which you both touched on as motivation, but I don't think I've talked through quite enough, is how we get the vaccine funded and distributed to the poorer countries of the world, who may or may not be part of this agreement. Mary Lovely, our colleague at Peterson, raises the idea that if there are poor countries who are not part of the supply chain, there's no incentive for them to participate in this agreement. How do they get their interests looked after? Michael Feldman says, referencing his PEPFAR experience, is there a way ODA and philanthropic dollars can provide an incentive for funding and getting access to this in the developing countries? So I realize that's not the focus of your article, because if we don't do what you're arguing for, we don't get there. But next step, what should be done in this context in terms of getting the vaccine out to the developing world?
So what I'll say quickly on that front is that I think kovacs is a promising initiative to address it. And I actually think it will succeed at its core mandate, which is, given enough time, addressing priority health needs in lower income countries. They are fundraising for it currently. It is unfortunate that we need a philanthropist to step in the void of global leadership, but Bill Gates is trying his best to do so on this and has been trying to rally support behind a collective approach in kovacs. And they have been able to get EU support and a number of other countries' support. The question, again, is really that first year. And that's where I think they will struggle. In a long enough time frame, we may see what we saw around HIV, which is high-income countries manage to produce treatments and deliver them to themselves, and then a series of years existed where the pandemic raged in poorer nations. We may see that with COVID, and that is not an outcome anyone should want.
No, absolutely right. And we know that the numbers are starting to grow massively in developing countries as we speak. One of the questions that came in is from Vandana Gyanchandli, forgive my pronunciation, which was following up in a sense on Tom, although she asked it beforehand. Can the EU be the leader towards initiating the COVID-19 vaccine trade and investment agreement? I mean, we've spoken a lot about China and US, but is there room for the EU to provide leadership, and what can they do to nudge the others along?
I think there is room, and they were exercising it. They were a leader behind the launch of kovacs. The only thing I will say there is that they have subsequently taken steps away from it. So they do seem like they will fund it as, again, a traditional donor-funded philanthropic initiative for addressing low-income country needs. But the fact that and again, I haven't seen an official statement in this regard, just the press reports. If it is in fact true that the Commission is urging its member states to forego their own use of that initiative, it will fundamentally limit its prospects as a global solution.
Okay, Chad, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think, the European Union suffered early on in the crisis by having to take steps that I'm sure they didn't want to do on personal protective equipment, by having to impose export restrictions because you had all of these problems between EU member states. So they got off on the wrong foot. They do seem to have things under control. They have other obvious pressing political, economic issues that they're going through as well, just to kind of keeping their own member states in line. So they have their own sort of domestic politics that they too have to worry about. And that is, what you fear is perhaps a constraining factor. That being said, one hopes, and talk to folks, and they seem to be talking with other like-minded countries that are generally thinking about the international system on these issues. And so, you sort of hope politically that they will be able to get there.
Okay. So the final question, since we have hit 11:45 and we're all being very quick-witted and quick promptness, is from our colleague at Peterson, Olivier Blanchard, and it is sadly rather cynical. If you think your country, say the US, is 90% likely to develop the vaccine first, will you be willing to write a sharing agreement? And if so, on what terms? I mean, so if we take what Tom said earlier about the low likelihood, for good reasons, that people will not trust or adopt the Chinese vaccine, then it seems very high likelihood the US will. So again, if we're making the case to the Trump administration, what is their incentive if they can peer behind the veil of ignorance and say, well, it's not entirely random whether I'm born lucky or not?
So I will start on the health and vaccine piece and leave Chad to give the economic answer to that. On from the vaccine side, again, the supply chains are unavoidably global. Because science hasn't determined which vaccine candidate will succeed. We're not certain we have supplies locked up despite all the US's efforts. And even if we do, things go wrong, and we will want supplies potentially from elsewhere. So in our article, we highlight an adjuvant that is key to multiple of the vaccines that's produced in countries that don't manufacture. Sweden processes it, and the underlying raw ingredient comes from Chile. Those kinds of scenarios abound in vaccine inputs and manufacturing. Even if we're confident we have the vaccine doses today, we may not be able to produce them tomorrow, and we certainly may not get access to the other vaccines we need to put an effective stop to this pandemic domestically.
Yeah, and so another way of saying that is we may invent it, but we may be unable to produce it because we lack all of the inputs, and other countries can hold us up unless we de facto ex post are willing to share. I mean, I agree with the spirit of Olivier's question. It would have been easier to write, 3 months ago when there was much more uncertainty, and as the uncertainty disappears, it gets trickier and trickier to write. But I think we can still write some sort of sharing agreement even as we get closer. And I think it's imperative that we do for these other reasons. And especially, we're going to, even with the first vaccine, we're not going to know if over the long run that one does the job, and we're going to want to have access to the second, the third ones, which may not be ours. So I think there is a strong incentive to cooperate, even if we do ultimately look like we may be getting the first one to actually come out of the gates.
Okay, thank you very much, Chad Bown, Tom Bolky, co-authors of the new article released yesterday on Foreign Affairs Online, Tragedy of Vaccine Nationalism, Only Cooperation Can End the Pandemic. They're right. Please take the message forward. Please read the article. Please look at the follow-up materials we and CFR have on PIIE.com. And please join us again as we try to contribute to timely, constructive international action in response to the COVID pandemic. Thank you very much.